American stealth bombers just cracked open the most heavily fortified nuclear bunkers on Earth. The desert is actively burning. 9 million panicked civilians are choking the highways out of Tehran. Washington accepts a ceasefire, fully expecting a total, humiliating surrender. Instead, the Iranian president walks onto national television, stares directly into the camera, and calls the smoking rubble of his own country a great victory. You are sitting at home watching this, thinking it is pure political delusion. How can a nation get ruthlessly bombed and celebrate? But look at the actual math. Global oil is violently surging past $100 a barrel. The American military is completely trapped. And the nation that just absorbed a catastrophic bombing campaign is quietly seizing control of the global economy. The United States did not win a ceasefire. The American empire just walked directly into a fatal trap. When the American military looks at a map, they count the number of craters. They measure success by the sheer tonnage of concrete destroyed and the number of enemy commanders eliminated. But winning a geopolitical war in the 21st century is absolutely not a football game. There is no final buzzer, and there is no trophy handed out for the highest body count. The United States and Israel launched a massive historic strike with one explicit goal. They wanted to permanently destroy the nuclear capabilities and devastate the military of a strategic rival. They inflicted catastrophic physical damage, but when the smoke cleared, the Islamic Republic of Iran was still standing. The regime did not fracture. The government did not collapse. In a brutal war of attrition, simply surviving the full wrath of the most powerful military machine on Earth is not political spin. It is a profound strategic victory. And while American politicians were busy celebrating their tactical hits, they entirely missed the devastating trap that had just snapped shut around their own empire. To deeply understand why the American empire walked directly into this fatal trap, you must understand the actual strategy of the enemy. The military commanders in Tehran are entirely rational actors. They look at the sheer size of the United States armed forces, they look at the advanced stealth fighters, and they know absolutely they cannot win a conventional head-to-head war. If they fight the Americans in the open desert, they will be violently erased. So for decades, they built a completely different kind of war machine. They built the axis of resistance. They meticulously funded and heavily armed a sprawling shadow network stretching across the entire Middle East. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and heavily armed proxy militias operating deep inside Iraq and Syria. The fundamental idea driving this shadow network is brutally simple. You do not punch the American giant directly in the chest. You aggressively poke them everywhere all at once so they can never get comfortable. You deliberately keep them bleeding slowly. You force them to spend massive amounts of money and military attention in the Middle East forever. But the true genius of this strategy is the terrifying financial asymmetry. This is exactly how you bankrupt a global superpower. When proxy forces launch a suicide drone toward a commercial shipping vessel in the Red Sea, that basic drone costs approximately $20,000 to manufacture. To successfully stop that incredibly cheap piece of flying plastic, the United States Navy fires a highly advanced interceptor from a billion-dollar destroyer. That single American interceptor missile costs the taxpayer roughly $2 million. Every single time the American military successfully defends itself, it loses an astronomical amount of national wealth. It is a mathematical death spiral. Iran is actively forcing the United States to burn through billions of dollars in highly advanced munitions just to swat away cheap, mass-produced drones. The Iranian goal was never to defeat the United States on a traditional battlefield. The ultimate goal is to completely exhaust the American economy, relentlessly drain its military stockpiles, and ensure Washington is permanently chained to the Middle East. The recent ceasefire simply proves that the bleeding is working flawlessly. In June of 2025, the Long Shadow War finally exploded into the terrifying light. The sheer scale of the violence was absolutely staggering. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, sending over 200 fighter jets directly into hostile airspace. They flew 1,500 sorties in just 12 days, systematically dismantling over 100 Iranian military and nuclear facilities. Shortly after, the United States military entered the theater directly, dropping massive bunker-buster bombs onto the absolute crown jewels of the Iranian nuclear program in Natanz and Isfahan. The physical destruction was so severe that 9 million Iranian citizens completely abandoned major cities, desperately fleeing toward the northern provinces to survive. But the Iranian military command did not fracture. They immediately unleashed Operation True Promise 3. 550 ballistic missiles and 1,000 suicide drones darkened the skies over the Middle East, aimed directly at the heart of Israel. The Western media networks immediately focused on the interception rate. Roughly 90% of those incoming weapons were successfully destroyed high in the atmosphere. But in modern asymmetric warfare, a 90% success rate is a lethal failure. 31 advanced ballistic missiles violently broke through the most sophisticated air defense shield on the planet. They slammed directly into a major power station, a vital oil refinery, and a university. 28 Israelis were killed. This 12-day exchange revealed the terrifying new reality of the Middle East. The physical damage inflicted upon the Iranian infrastructure was undeniably apocalyptic. But the psychological shockwave that completely shattered the illusion of absolute Western invulnerability was permanent. The ultimate fortress had been successfully breached, and the enemy was still breathing. On June 23, 2025, the unthinkable happened. 14 ballistic missiles were fired directly at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That facility is not just a desert outpost. It is the absolute beating heart of American military operations across the entire Middle East. In any previous decade, launching a physical strike against a major American installation guaranteed an immediate apocalyptic wave of stealth bombers. You do not strike the empire without facing complete annihilation. But look at exactly what happened next. The American response was not fire and fury. The response was a social media post. The former American president publicly thanked Tehran for what he called a weak response, and within hours, Washington desperately announced a brokered ceasefire. The absolute most powerful nation on earth did not unleash its military might. Instead, the White House aggressively picked up the phone and pressured its own closest ally to stand down. Under massive diplomatic pressure from Washington, Israel was forced to completely cancel a devastating retaliatory campaign, ultimately firing at one single, lonely radar site near Tehran. You have to ask yourself why Washington suddenly blinked. Why did the ultimate superpower absorb a direct military hit and immediately push for peace? The answer is entirely domestic. The political establishment in Washington is absolutely terrified of a full-scale ground war. They know that putting vulnerable American boots into the Iranian mountains would instantly ignite global inflation, completely crash the domestic economy, and violently destroy their political survival back home. They looked at the geopolitical board and deliberately chose a humiliating peace over a catastrophic war. When a hostile nation can launch ballistic missiles directly at an American military base, and the American response is a desperate diplomatic scramble to freeze the conflict, a fundamental red line has been permanently erased. The United States did not successfully negotiate a master ceasefire. By actively refusing to strike back, they completely surrendered the only currency that actually matters in the Middle East. They surrendered the absolute power of deterrence. To comprehend exactly why the leadership in Tehran was actively celebrating while their cities burned, you must fundamentally change how you view victory. Western military academies teach that a nation wins a war by utterly destroying the capacity of the enemy to fight. But the Islamic Republic operates on a completely different psychological and historical wavelength. They operate strictly on the Shia doctrine of survival. For centuries, this specific culture has defined itself as a persecuted minority, uniquely willing to endure unimaginable sacrifice. When the United States and Israel unleashed their massive coordinated air campaign, the explicit goal was to finally shatter the regime. They desperately wanted to decapitate the leadership and watch the government permanently collapse under the sheer weight of the physical devastation. But the supreme leader remained firmly in power. The government did not fall. In the brutal calculus of the Middle East, surviving a direct, full-scale assault from the absolute strongest military alliance on earth is not just a propaganda talking point. It is a monumental historic victory. They explicitly proved to the entire world that they could take the ultimate American punch and remain standing. But the true strategic nightmare for Washington is what happened immediately after the dust settled. The American political establishment launched this massive war specifically to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Let us look directly at the devastating irony of that exact decision. Before the American bombs fell, the Iranian nuclear program was actively monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They had live cameras in the facilities and human inspectors on the ground. The very moment the ceasefire was signed, the Iranian parliament aggressively voted to permanently end all international cooperation. They completely ripped out the cameras, expelled the inspectors, and effectively blinded the entire international community. The American empire went to war to control a nuclear threat, and instead they completely unleashed it. The physical facilities were heavily damaged, but Washington fundamentally handed Tehran the ultimate political justification to retreat entirely into the shadows. The regime can now rebuild its nuclear infrastructure with absolutely zero international oversight. By attempting to aggressively close the door on an Iranian nuclear weapon, the United States military violently blew the door completely off its hinges. The terrifying countdown to a nuclear breakout is no longer being carefully monitored. It is now ticking silently in the dark. For over a decade, the grand strategic vision of the Pentagon has been built around one desperate goal. They called it the pivot to Asia. The American political establishment desperately wanted to pack up their sprawling desert bases, physically withdraw from the endless Middle Eastern conflicts, and rotate the massive American war machine directly toward the Pacific. They knew they urgently needed to confront the rapidly expanding military power of China and the aggressive territorial ambitions of Russia. That was the grand imperial dream. Now, look directly at the geopolitical reality. By 2026, that highly publicized Asian pivot is completely dead. Instead of elegantly leaving the Middle East, the United States is helplessly sinking back into the exact same suffocating quicksand. Look at the current deployment maps. The American military is now more deeply entangled in the region than it has been in years. Tens of thousands of American troops are heavily scattered across Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Massive nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups are relentlessly parked in the surrounding waters. Top diplomats and presidential envoys are constantly scrambling across the desert in a desperate, exhausting bid to hold the crumbling security architecture together. This does not look like a dominant superpower smoothly transitioning to a new global theater. This looks like an aging empire caught in a brutal, inescapable trap. You must ask yourself who is actually benefiting from this massive strategic failure. Look directly at Moscow and Beijing. The Eastern powers are quietly standing on the sidelines, completely untouched, smiling as the American empire violently exhausts its military resources, burns its diplomatic credibility, and entirely drains its national focus on a regional proxy war. Every single day, the United States Navy is heavily pinned down. Guarding the Red Sea is a day they cannot project true, overwhelming power in the South China Sea. The strategy orchestrated by Tehran was an absolute masterclass in geopolitical manipulation. They knew they could not defeat the American military in a straight fight, so they used America's own massive imperial weight against it. Washington desperately wanted to pivot away and secure the future of the global order. Iran explicitly ensured the American empire will remain permanently chained to the sand. To completely understand the ultimate leverage of the Iranian regime, you must look away from the burning military bases and look directly at the water. By early 2026, the proxy war violently transitioned into open conflict, and Tehran finally played its absolute most devastating card. They targeted the global economic jugular. They targeted the Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a body of water. It is a dangerously narrow geographic corridor in the Persian Gulf. Every single day, 20% of all the oil consumed on planet Earth, alongside roughly 20% of the global liquefied natural gas supply, must physically pass through that incredibly tight bottleneck. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard officially declared the strait entirely closed. They explicitly threatened to set any commercial vessel attempting passage completely ablaze. Almost immediately, massive cargo tankers were critically damaged. 150 vital shipping vessels were helplessly stranded in the water. Effectively, more than 90% of the normal global energy flow through that vital corridor was violently choked off. The financial reaction was instantaneous and completely terrifying. Global oil prices violently shot past $100 a barrel, with panicked market analysts projecting a catastrophic spike toward 150. The International Energy Agency, desperate to prevent a total global economic collapse, was forced to suddenly release a historic 400 million barrels of emergency crude reserves just to artificially slow the bleeding. But here is the brutal reality that the political establishment in Washington refuses to explain. A conflict happening 7,000 miles away is absolutely not a distant foreign policy abstraction. It is a direct, violent tax on the American working class. When the price of global crude oil explodes, every single American driver feels the immediate crushing devastation at the gas pump. That massive price spike violently rips wealth directly out of the wallets of retired Americans trying to survive on fixed incomes. It dramatically increases the transportation cost of every single piece of food delivered to a domestic grocery store. The United States military was fundamentally designed and funded to protect the free flow of global commerce. By successfully closing that specific strait, Iran did not just paralyze American foreign policy. They successfully weaponized the entire global economy and dropped the devastating financial bill directly onto the kitchen tables of American families. To understand the absolute collapse of American global leverage, you must look at what happened next in the shadows of international diplomacy. With global oil markets violently bleeding and the American domestic economy flashing red, the political establishment in Washington did something historically unprecedented. They quietly begged for a way out. The United States government drafted a 15-point ceasefire proposal and cautiously sent it to Tehran, using the government of Pakistan as a silent middleman. The American diplomats asked Iran to accept strict limits on its rapidly advancing nuclear program, agree to severe restrictions on its ballistic missiles, and absolutely guarantee the free passage of commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, Washington offered a familiar concession. They offered to lift crippling economic sanctions. To the untrained eye, this looks like standard geopolitical diplomacy, but to anyone actually paying attention to the board, it was a desperate plea from a financially exhausted superpower. The Iranian regime looked directly at the American proposal and rejected it flat out. They did not even attempt to negotiate the margins. Instead, they sent back a brutal counter-proposal that effectively rewrote the rules of the modern world. Tehran demanded that the United States formally recognize absolute Iranian sovereignty over the entire Strait of Hormuz. And then they delivered the ultimate insult. They demanded that the United States pay them massive war reparations. Pause for a moment and let that terrifying geopolitical reality sink in. For 80 years, the American empire dictated the absolute terms of global surrender. Washington consistently used the brutal, overwhelming power of its economic sanctions to systematically starve its adversaries into complete submission. Now the exact opposite is happening. A regional power in the Middle East is successfully weaponizing the global energy market to financially extort the United States. The Iranian leadership absorbed the absolute best punch the American military could physically throw. They completely paralyzed the global economy, and now they are demanding that Washington literally pay them for the privilege of a ceasefire. You tell me who actually holds the leverage in that room. That is not just a temporary diplomatic failure. That is the ultimate, undeniable humiliation of the American empire. As the global energy markets violently hemorrhage and the American diplomatic leverage completely collapses, it is time to look at the final bill. The United States political establishment launched a massive, historic military campaign to permanently secure its dominance in the Middle East. Let us evaluate exactly what they bought with that astronomical price tag. Yes, the physical damage inflicted upon Iran was apocalyptic. The Iranian proxy networks, Hamas and Hezbollah, were severely degraded. Thousands of Iranian citizens are dead, and their immediate nuclear infrastructure is heavily damaged. But look at what the American taxpayer paid to achieve that temporary destruction. 6 American soldiers are dead. The highly elite 82nd Airborne Division, the absolute tip of the American military spear, had to be violently deployed straight into a burning region. And the global price of oil is violently trading above $100 a barrel, a devastating financial tax that is currently crushing the American middle class. And what did the United States actually achieve? The Islamic Republic of Iran is still standing. The supreme leader is still in power. The Iranian military still firmly holds the key to the most important global oil choke point on Earth. And worst of all, the Iranian regime is now operating its nuclear program completely in the dark with absolutely zero international oversight. But the absolute darkest reality, the true cost of this entire geopolitical disaster, is the message that was permanently broadcasted to the rest of the world. Every single adversary of the United States, from Beijing to Moscow, watched this 12-day war with intense fascination. They saw that a middle power like Iran could absorb the absolute full, terrifying force of American and Israeli air power and simply refuse to fall. That story does not go away. That story physically travels across the globe. The American empire went into the desert to prove it was still the absolute master of the global order. Instead, they proved the exact opposite. They proved that simply having the biggest military budget on Earth no longer guarantees a victory. The myth of American invincibility has been permanently shattered, and as the exhausted American public quietly pays the devastating financial bill, the rest of the world is already preparing for what comes next.